I think one of the biggest things that we need to tell both girls and boys is, look, sexual feelings are totally normal. They're
Hmm.
totally natural. They're good.
Uh-huh.
It's part of who you are now. They're not a problem. And noticing someone is attractive, feeling attracted to someone, that's not a sin.
It's a beautiful thing. Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. I have 6 children, including 3 daughters, and I want to raise them well. I want to set them up for success in their future marriages and relationships. Research shows that how we talk to our children, especially our daughters, about dating, sex, and relationships can affect the type of person they may marry and how satisfied they'll be in their marriage. After doing this interview you're about to hear, I realized that there's a few areas that I can improve in as a father. Sheila Wray Gregoire is a friend of mine, as well as the author of several books on the topic of sex and marriage. Her books are awesome, especially for those seeking helpful and accurate information from a Christian perspective. She's really funny too. She has 2 daughters and an angel son and 2 grandchildren. I didn't know this until this interview, but according to my guest Sheila today, in her research, my generation, the millennials, grew up with the least comprehensive sex education compared to Generation X and the baby boomer generations. I learned that the most important thing is to have a great relationship with your child. There are also things to consider about how we talk about modesty, agency, arousal, consent, and self-definition to our children, especially our daughters. Before we get into the interview, I just want to let you know, if you haven't heard, we've announced a fun and exciting virtual marriage retreat. Now, this is different from the in-person retreats we do. This retreat focuses more on sex, technique, pleasure, passion, and deep connection during sex. It's the kind of retreat where you and your spouse would want to get a hotel room or send the kids to grandma's for the weekend and join us live over Zoom webinar in 3 sessions. It's coming up on June 9th and 10th, which happens to fall on International Lovemaking Day this year. You can sign up or get more information about it at getyourmarriageon.com, click on retreat, and then virtual retreat. Sheila, I am so honored to have you back on the Get Your Marriage On podcast today. How are you?
I am doing great. Thanks, Dan. Good to be here.
I'm really looking forward to talking about our topic because you're an author, you're a speaker, you have a fantastic blog and podcast, Bare Marriage. You've written this new book that I have, She Deserves Better, which you told me is ranked in 123 on Amazon
Yeah, it
overall,
was yesterday. I know.
which is fantastic. It's
Yeah.
selling. So this is a book about, how to raise a daughter to have a more positive view of sexuality because she deserves a better message than what,
Mhm.
the generation before, the culture has handed her. So as an author, you'd think you have it all put together. I want to know, have you always been great at teaching your daughters about sex? Have you ever messed up in the message?
Oh, yeah. No, we laugh about how bad I did, of how
Okay.
bad a job I did when I first told them about sex. So when my oldest, Rebecca, who's actually one of the co-authors on She Deserves Better, when she was 10, I took her away for a weekend and I was supposed to tell her about sex. We had this CD that we listened to, and it explained that the penis was kind of like having a finger down there that could move. And Rebecca told me later she couldn't figure out why guys were always scratching their testicles then, because if they had a finger, why wouldn't they just use that? So
Ah, uh-huh.
so
That's
yes,
good.
she did not quite understand. And yeah, and then with my younger daughter, I just forgot to tell her about a ton of things. She used to cut herself shaving all the time because she didn't know how to shave. It was just bad because
Uh-huh.
her older sister taught her most of the stuff.
Uh-huh.
But well, I like to tell parents, you know what? You can totally mess up, doesn't matter, as long as you keep the conversations going. That's the main thing. You don't need to be perfect. You never have to
Mhm.
be perfect. I wasn't perfect, but my kids grew up really well, and they were always able to talk to me, and we could laugh about it afterwards, and that's the big thing.
Right, right. And I think as a parent I have 3 daughters, I probably messed up and I'm still messing up now, but you got to give yourself a little bit of grace in all
Mhm.
this too.
Yep. Nobody has to be perfect, you just need to have a relationship. That's the big thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. So I want to talk about a few things today. So when my wife was 13 or 14, she had a lot of questions about her developing body and periods and boys and things like that. but she was really nervous to go to her parents about it
Mhm.
because they didn't really talk about it much. She tells me how she wrote them all out on like an index card, her questions, maybe 2 index cards, and she was so nervous she like couldn't directly talk to mom and dad about it, so she like flipped it, like, "Here's my questions." And she remembers seeing her mom react, like, with, like, so much embarrassment. Like, the mom's reaction in that moment was kinda like, "We don't talk about these things." Mom
Mhm.
was obviously embarrassed about these things and had a difficult time talking about these things, and a lot of my wife's questions went unanswered in that moment. Like, why is it as parents we have a hard time talking about, you know, things that every person goes through? Where does
I
this come from, you think?
I think there's 2 reasons. First of all, I think a lot of us are carrying shame ourselves. So
Mhm.
when our parents didn't handle it well, when we feel residual shame about our bodies, when we feel guilty for things we've done, when we're not comfortable talking about it, it's very hard to talk to our kids. The other thing is I think we have this fear that if we say something out loud, they're now going to do it. I remember when my youngest was 14, she came home from summer camp and she said, "Oh my gosh, mom, the sex talk was so bad. Next year, you just have to do it because they didn't even talk about oral sex. And like all my friends are having oral sex and they don't even realize like that still counts as something bad." And she's going on about this. And I'm trying to keep this totally straight face
Uh-huh.
because I didn't realize my 14-year-old knew what oral sex was.
Uh-huh.
But she felt totally comfortable talking to me about it because we do have that kind of relationship. But I thought about it afterwards and I thought, why was it that I was so scared of talking to her about that or about masturbation? And you realize that you feel like once they know what it is, you've somehow sexualized them.
Or
Like,
corrupted them. Uh-huh.
yeah, like even if
Uh-huh.
they don't go out and do it, they are somehow now sexual beings in a way that they weren't before. And
Mhm.
that's just not true. Like knowledge does not make someone more sexual than they were before.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, as we're about to talk about with the new book, what we found is that the more information kids have, the more protective it is.
Mhm.
Like information is never a bad thing. The more
Right.
information they have, the better it is for their long-term self-esteem, for their ability to choose a good marriage partner, for their
Uh-huh.
future marital and sexual satisfaction. More information is always good.
Otherwise, you run into a reality gap
Mhm.
because what you don't know, your brain will fill in the gaps of what you think it's gonna be, and then
Mhm.
reality hits, and the wider that reality gap, the harder people are gonna have to adjust to reality.
Exactly, and also, if they can't get it from you, then they're gonna get it from someone else,
Yes.
and then they're gonna feel like the most important part of my life I can't share with my parents, and you don't want that
Right.
either.
Right, of course. Okay, one hot topic is modesty. Let's talk
Mhm.
about modesty for a second. First, when we talk about quote unquote modesty, what do people really mean?
Yeah, so whenever we say women need to dress modestly, and it's normally aimed at women, right? Like, this
Yes.
is almost
Uh-huh.
always a conversation about women,
Yes.
um,
Uh-huh. Young
because
women especially. Uh-huh.
yes, because of course girls aren't visual, but men are. That's what we say. Not true, but that's what we say.
Uh-huh.
But what they mean is that girls should dress in a way so that they don't sexually excite or arouse or draw attention to their body, and so they don't sexually excite men. So it's like girls have to dress to cover up their body because their body is somehow dangerous to those around them.
Gotcha. Why is that such a harmful message?
Well, okay, so let me tell you what we did with She Deserves Better. So I wrote The Great Sex Rescue. I've talked to your audience before about that project where we surveyed 20,000 women to find out if there are certain teachings that are common in church circles that make marital and sexual satisfaction plummet. And we identified quite a few that are really bad that hurt women's sex lives.
Mhm.
And after that book came out, I had all these women saying, okay, I feel seen. I feel validated. This is amazing. I feel free, but now I don't know what to do with my kids. Like I'm totally lost because I grew up with toxic messaging. I don't want to pass that toxic messaging on to my kids, but I also don't want to say to my 14-year-old, go do whatever you want. Like, you know, have total freedom because that's not good either. And so we wanted to do another research project to help parents out because I know this is a really rough thing. So we
Mhm.
surveyed another 7,000 women.
That's a lot of
um,
women.
it
Uh-huh.
is.
Moms.
Yeah,
These
it
are
is.
moms. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and not all are moms, but
Okay.
just 7,000 women,
Uh-huh.
not all are married either, to find out if their experiences in church and the messages that they heard in church as teens,
Oh,
and
gotcha.
then we followed them to see how that impacted them as adults.
Okay.
So their marital and sexual satisfaction now, if they are married, if they married an abuser, what's their self-esteem like? Because self-esteem is highly correlated with better mental health, with better job prospects, with better relationships. It's a good thing overall. So,
Hmm.
so we looked at all these things that girls could hear as teens, and then we followed those women to see what happened to them as adults, so that we could say, "Hey, this is really bad. We don't want to do this anymore, and
Uh-huh.
here's something to do instead." And modesty was one of the biggest things that we looked at that had the biggest negative effect, the modesty messages.
Wow.
Yeah, so we looked at 4 different iterations because when we talk about modesty, we talk about it in different ways. So we measured 4 different ways that girls could hear that message. So,
Uh-huh.
boys are visual in a way that girls never can understand. Boys can't help but lust if a girl is dressed like she's trying to incite it.
Uh-huh.
Um, Girls have a responsibility to dress modestly so they aren't stumbling blocks for boys, and girls who dress modestly are better than those who don't. And we let people taking the survey make up their own mind what better meant.
Uh-huh.
And all 4 of those messages are terrible. Like,
Oh, wow.
just
Yeah,
awful
yeah.
long term.
Uh-huh.
Um, they do a real number on women's self-esteem.
Mhm.
So self-esteem plummets. They're more likely to marry an abuser, more likely to have sexual pain, more likely to have worse marriages and sex lives. And if you believe the ones about the boys in particular, those were the most harmful. The boys are visual and boys can't help but lust.
Uh-huh.
Your chance of experiencing vaginismus or sexual pain increases by 52%.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, your chance of marrying an abuser increases by 68%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like, it's just bad overall, and there's no there's no need for it. Like, we can talk about this in such a different way, but it was just universally awful.
Any sense as to why it is that when you internalize the message that I need to cover up or boys will lust and so
Mhm.
on, why that has a high correlation to, like, marrying an abuser? Like, why is that?
Well, I yeah, I think we know on this. Oh, here, let me give you another one, which is kinda related. Girls who believe this are more likely to be in churches where they will be harassed or abused themselves. So and here's what we think is happening. When churches teach the modesty message,
Uh-huh,
what
and you
they're
put that in
essentially
air quotes, right, uh-huh,
yes, air
right,
quotes,
uh-huh,
yes.
uh-huh,
What they're essentially saying is that girls are responsible to stop men from sinning against them.
mhm.
So if a man lusts after the girl, it's actually the girl's fault. It's not
It's
the
the girl's
guy's
fault.
fault. It's the girl's fault because of what she was wearing. And let's say that you're someone who wants to abuse a teenage girl who wants to assault a girl. What kind of a church are you going to go to? You're going to go to one that tells you, hey, if you do something to a girl, it's not your fault.
Ah, you're off the
It
hook.
Yeah, and so
Mhm,
these kinds of churches, they attract abusers, but they also grow abusers because we teach boys, "Hey, nothing's your fault, it's the girl's fault." And when we teach girls, if he treats you badly, if he does something bad to you, it's because you did something, then we're telling girls, "Ignore red flags." Like, those red flags, that doesn't matter. Like, if he lusts after you, the problem is not that he's a predator, the problem is that he's male. And so
ah,
we
right,
teach girls that all men are predators. And
mhm,
so how are they going to know that this person is actually not good for me because all men must be like this? So if
uh-huh,
they're with someone who treats them badly, they're not going to realize, "Oh, that's an anomaly. That's something I can get away from." They're just going to think, "Well, all guys are like this."
uh-huh. Well, that doesn't sound like a great statement for men.
No, I know. Like, why
Uh-huh.
don't men stand up and say, "Excuse me, hello?"
I have agency, I'm not a robot.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right?
Well, here's another one
Uh-huh.
that let me just
Mhm.
give you some examples, okay?
Okay. Mhm.
Because I think people can get it if they hear the examples. There was a curriculum that was widely used in more conservative churches back in the early 2000s, 2010s. I actually bought it to use with my kids. So
Uh-huh.
I
Is this
thought,
the CD that you listened to with your
no,
daughter
that
on that
was
trip?
earlier. This
Oh,
this
yeah.
was a book series. It was called Secret Keeper Girl. There were 8 dates that moms could do with their daughters, and I bought
Uh-huh.
it. We did the first one, and I was so well, okay, I'll tell you the first one.
Uh-huh.
So, they had you get a china teacup, and then
Uh-huh.
a ceramic mug, and then a styrofoam cup, and you were
Okay.
supposed to ask your girls, "Do you know any of your friends who treat themselves like styrofoam cups in the way that they
Uh-huh.
dress or the TV shows they watch?" And so the very first exercise is asking your kids to choose which of their friends is the trashiest.
Oh,
Like,
gotcha.
that's not okay. You know, we had a lot of kids that we from the neighborhood that hung out at our house who didn't
Uh-huh.
have great parent situations, and we
Uh-huh.
were just trying to love on them, and I didn't want
Uh-huh.
my girls to go around thinking you're trashy.
Uh-huh.
So
You're the styrofoam cup friend.
yeah, like, no, it was so inappropriate. So we
Uh-huh.
we didn't do any of the exercises, but as we were writing this book, we looked at the rest of it, and there a lot of it is about modesty. And there was
Mhm.
one particular test that they did where they told girls to raise their hands over their head and see when you put your hands up, does your belly show?
Uh-huh.
Because your belly isn't supposed to show because bellies are intoxicating.
Oh, they
And
are
then
so
they're
intoxicating.
so intoxicated. And then there was this conversation that moms are supposed to have with their daughters, and it wrote a script out for you where you were asking now, do you know what intoxicating means? It's like when a man is drunk and he gets out of control. And God made your body to be intoxicating to men, but you're only supposed to intoxicate your future husband. So you need to make sure that you cover up so you're not intoxicating to other men.
I remember reading that in your book, yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Now, this was written to girls 8 to 12. So we were telling 8-year-old girls that seeing their belly would cause an adult man to get out of control.
Mhm. Like intoxicated with alcohol or some other substance.
Yeah, like, that's
Uh-huh.
disgusting.
Uh-huh.
That is pedophilia. It's straight up pedophilia. They were
Mhm.
excusing pedophilia. Um, and imagine what that does to a little girl if she hears this when she's 8, and then when she's 11, some adult man gropes her in church, and she thinks, "Well, I must have been wearing something that intoxicated him. I must have done something because it's my fault he got out of control."
Right.
And so she's blaming herself, and that's a lot of the reasons why we see these negative, repercussions years later.
Or maybe not as pernicious, but later on, she does show her belly and the husband doesn't, respond intoxicatingly.
Mhm,
And then she
mhm.
thinks there's something wrong with her body.
Exactly.
Right. It's like, wait a minute.
Yes.
You're supposed to like be drunk
Yeah.
over me.
Exactly. So it's really harmful.
Mhm.
And this is the message that we've been giving both girls and guys, and we do make men sound like total animals. There was another belief that we measured for girls, which was boys can't stop in a makeout situation. They get out of control, and so it's girls' responsibility to stop the sexual progression.
Uh-huh.
We also measured this one when we did the Great Sex Rescue. We called it the gatekeeper message that, boys are
Yes.
gonna push your boundaries, and so
Mhm.
girls are responsible to stop. And again, it's that idea that boys can't stop.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And if we're telling girls that boys can't stop, and we're telling girls that if you dress in a certain way, you're gonna incite lust in him,
Mhm.
then let's say a girl starts kissing with her boyfriend,
Uh-huh.
and she says no, but he keeps pushing. And eventually he assaults her or rapes her. She's gonna feel like, "Well, I started to kiss him, so what did I expect?"
Yeah, it's my fault that I got assaulted.
Right, exactly,
Right.
because he can't help it, and that was actually taught in our books to girls. There was a big book that was popular in the early 2000s called, For Young Women Only,
Okay.
where it said that 82% of boys based on a really bad study. The question was badly worded, the possible answers were badly worded, so this isn't actually accurate. But she
Uh-huh.
said that 82% of boys have either little ability or little responsibility to stop in a makeout situation. So if you want to stop, it's safest to not even start. But imagine telling girls that
Uh-huh.
82% of boys might have no ability to stop. Like that's straight up rape culture. 100% of boys have the ability to stop. 100%. But if we're saying 82% might not and that they feel no responsibility, then if you are date raped, you feel like, well, what did I expect? I kissed him.
Right. Mhm.
And we in our focus groups, we talked to so many women who were date raped, and that's what they believed. They didn't even realize for like a decade afterwards that it was actually rape because they felt like they had done something to provoke him. And that's just such a dangerous message. That causes so much sexual shame and confusion for women later. And a lot of people who are currently parents grew up with all of this messaging. And
Mhm.
we need to unpack it if we're going to raise our kids well.
So you also talked about how the modesty message is often taught as a substitute for real sex education. Can you
Mhm.
talk on that?
Yeah, so instead of giving kids actually accurate information,
Uh-huh.
what we do instead is we say, "Don't do it." That's what we don't do it, and don't and dress so that you don't incite lust. Make sure that no one's ever thinking about sex. It doesn't work. It really doesn't. It's interesting. So we studied 7,000 women, and after we were running all the numbers, we were able to divide people into generations. And
Uh-huh.
I'm Gen X, so
Okay.
I'm older than you. You're probably are you an old
I'm
millennial?
millennial. Yep.
You're an elderly millennial, right? Or
Yep.
whatever they call them. Yeah.
It makes you sound old.
I know, I love that.
I'm
The elder
millennial.
You're an elder millennial. But, I'm Gen X, and my generation got better sex ed than millennials did.
Really?
Yeah, and even the boomers did. Like, it's crazy when millennials came in, and there's a reason for that. In the '80s, we think that things are steadily getting worse. They're actually not. In the '80s, when I was a teenager, teen pregnancy rates were skyrocketing. Rates of teen sexual activity was very high. Drug and alcohol use were very high. They were
Uh,
all higher than they are today.
uh-huh.
Now, today we have worse mental health for teenagers. We have more porn use and we have more oral sex. So it's not that everything is better, but a
Mhm.
lot of things are actually better. And so after the '80s, public schools, all these different counties, they wanted to reduce teen pregnancy rates. And so they were putting in comprehensive sex ed
Uh-huh.
and they were pushing it lower and lower. And a lot of Christian parents were really upset about this and said, "No, I don't want my kids to hear all of this." And
Mhm.
so abstinence only education came in. A lot of people pulled their kids out of the public school system. Churches really changed how they talked about sex. So we got rid of all the sex ed that was actually quite common for my generation.
Gotcha. Uh-huh.
And we replaced it with simply don't do it.
I see. Uh-huh.
So, we gave in our survey, we gave 10 different 10 different words that had to do with sex, and we asked girls, "How many of these words could you define at the point where you graduated high school?"
Uh-huh.
How old were you when you knew that female orgasms existed? Did you know what date rape was? And on pretty much every measure, Gen X and boomers did better than millennials.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, and so
That's a surprise to me, but
mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I don't think that would be true necessarily of the culture as a whole, but we were specifically looking at women who grew up in conservative religious homes.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's a problem because when you get rid of sex ed and you only teach don't do it, there's a big conversation that's missing, and that conversation is consent.
Yes.
We
Which
never
is a
talk
huge part of anyone's sexual health. Right.
exactly, and it,
Uh-huh.
it it goes into marriage too. Like consent is something which
Yes.
matters in marriage as well.
Yes.
But when the only message is don't do it, then churches and schools felt like, well, we don't need to talk about consent then because the kids shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Mhm.
And so we never talked about things like arousal or arousal non-concordance or how just because you're aroused does not mean you consented.
Yes.
We
Uh-huh.
never told kids this. And it really did result in a lot of harm for women, especially long term, and also for men who just didn't know that they were expected to respect the person they're with,
Mhm.
because I think men were just taught, "She'll stop you if
Mhm.
she doesn't want it, and, well, if she wasn't stopping, then I can do whatever I want."
Right, right. Which is not. That kinda
Mhm.
takes away a person's self-control.
Yep,
Such an
exactly.
important part. Yeah, okay, so you don't give them a comprehensive sex education, and instead you focus on the don't do it message and modesty only
Mhm. Mhm.
as a substitute for that. Gotcha.
And by the way, I wanna say too, you can still teach kids that they should save sex for marriage and give a comprehensive sex ed. Like, these things are not mutually exclusive.
Of course, right, right.
I'm not saying that we should just tell our
Uh-huh,
kids, "Hey, go do whatever you want." Not but we don't need to use scare tactics, and that's what we did. We used both threats and we used bribes. So the threat was, if you have sex before you're married, you're gonna get an STD, you're gonna get pregnant, you're gonna die, whatever it might be. And
mhm.
I'm not even exaggerating. A lot of the books actually talked about death. Um,
Oh,
um,
we'd have a lot more dead people if that were true.
oh, I know. And the thing about using threats like that is that
Uh-huh,
all of our kids are going to have friends who are having sex, who are not pregnant, who are not riddled with STDs, and who are not
uh-uh,
dead. And
right.
so, and so the threat doesn't work because as soon as they see that you're basically lying to them,
Mhm,
they're not going to believe what you have to say. The
right.
other thing we did was we used a bribe, right? If you wait for marriage for sex, sex is going to be the most amazing thing ever. And that's all we told them. We didn't tell them about the sexual response cycle. We didn't explain to them how a female orgasm works or how arousal works. We just said, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And then as soon as you get married, you're gonna get to do it all the time without really explaining things. And so a lot of couples got married and sex really wasn't that good.
Mm-mm.
And then they felt like they had been cheated.
Yeah. Right. So we talk about all the things not to do.
Mhm.
Let's focus on things to do. What's the better approach?
I think the best thing, honestly, is just like I said, keep talking to your kids. Keep
Hmm.
talking to them. You don't need to be perfect, but whenever things come up, when movies come up, when you're talking about friends or whatever, like talk about relationships, talk
Hmm.
about what you want for them. Make it so they can ask you questions. Talk about your own past. Like let them know that you're an open book. That
Hmm.
and obviously that needs to be age appropriate, but whenever you think, okay, by age 16 she should know this, subtract 3 years.
Okay.
You
Uh-huh.
know? Because kids are having these conversations really early now. And so
Hmm.
make sure that you're the one to have those conversations. That's really important. But I would also say, I think one of the biggest things that we need to tell both girls and boys is, and this is how I would phrase a lot of this stuff is look, sexual feelings are totally normal. They're
Hmm.
totally natural. They're good.
Uh-huh.
It's part of who you are now. They're not a problem. And noticing someone is attractive, feeling attracted to someone, that's not a sin.
It's a beautiful thing. I hope you feel attracted to other
Yeah.
people. I kind of grew up with that idea that having sexual thoughts is somehow sinful and evil. And here I am engaged to my wife. We're going to be married in a few weeks. And I can't help it. I have so many sexual thoughts. I'm excited, but I was
Mhm.
so ashamed to have these sexual thoughts. I thought something was wrong. Like I was using all my willpower to resist, but it was so hard, right?
Mhm.
And I'm not acting out on any of these things. These are just thoughts and urges that I'm recognizing that are like really waking up as I approach my wedding date. So I go to my, we call him a bishop. He's like a pastor in my
Yep.
church.
Mhm.
And I said, you know, I have all these sexual thoughts. I fantasize about her. Confessing my sins, kind of an idea, right? And he looks at me and he's like, well, you should be. You should have these thoughts. You're getting married. And then he tells me, now you got to understand, he's an accountant. So he's like stereotypical, like no personality kind of a guy. And he tells me like, I fantasize about my wife all the time. Like, and I'm like, really? You're allowed to do that? It's like, yeah, you're supposed to. And wait, he was so good because he totally normalized everything for me.
Yeah.
And it was so, like, comforting to have, like, a church leader say, "What's the big deal here? This is all good. This is normal." So I kinda walked out there a little confused, like, "Wait, I guess I'm not a sinful, like, dirty person. This is all good and healthy," and he normalized it for me, and it's so grateful for a church leader that had that wisdom for me to kinda
Yeah.
give me that message at that time. I
I love that.
want
I think too, we we forget that love, like when you truly love someone and when you're truly emotionally intimate with someone
and committed,
and
yes.
committed like you were when you're engaged, those that's gonna spur your desire to have sex. That's how we're designed, right?
And that's great. That's
Like
normal.
like
Uh-huh.
when your sexual desire is coming out of the purity, and I use purity in the good way of a good relationship that's moving towards marriage, like that's normal. Now like so there's a difference. That's something else that I think parents need to understand is too often we give exactly the same advice to someone who's 12 and someone who's 25.
Mhm.
And there is a difference. Your 14-year-old should probably not be dating. Okay. Your
Yeah.
14-year-old is
Uh-huh.
14.
Uh-huh. Right. Uh-huh.
Your 17-year-old, that's different, and your 21-year-old, that's different too. Um, we should be encouraging older ones to date if they wanna get married. If they don't wanna get married, no problem, people are allowed to choose to be single, but, we tend to do the same advice no matter what. So, for a 14-year-old, we should be saying, "Hey, you know what? Like, don't look at someone and fantasize about them and objectify them." But when someone's truly in love and about to get married, that's a totally different thing.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like,
Uh-huh.
yeah, like, and when you're in a relationship with someone you love, that's totally normal. That's not objectifying someone, and, yeah, we need to talk about these things differently with nuance.
That's right. Like, My college roommates would catch me like doing push-ups or whatever in my room. Like, oh, he's getting honeymoon ready. Somebody's horny or whatever like that. And I'd be embarrassed, but it was the truth. Like,
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
but it's driving us towards development. And that's the thing. Sexual desires, when
Mhm.
channeled appropriately, drive development.
But what's really important is you need to figure out what your boundaries are,
Right.
And I would like your boundaries to be waiting for marriage for sex if that's what you as a parent want. And here's why. It is your body. You can set those boundaries. The important thing is you know what your boundaries are. But even more important than that, you need to honor the boundaries of the person you're with. And that is absolutely crucial. And if you're ever with someone who doesn't honor your boundaries, that's a red flag that relationship isn't safe.
Yeah. I love that.
And
Love
that's
that.
what we should be telling to both our boys and girls.
Right.
Because the idea that, like, girls aren't sexual and girls aren't visual is so not true too. Like,
No.
I've talked to lots of men who were coerced into sex and who were really pushed beyond their boundaries by girls as well. So it's, it can go both ways. And so we need to talk about this to both boys and girls.
Right.
You
Goes both ways.
and the problem with boys in particular is that many sex acts can't happen unless he has an erection. And so he feels like, well, I had an erection, so I must have consented, whereas that's not necessarily the case at all.
Right. The non-concordance that you talked
Yeah.
about earlier.
Mhm.
Right. Okay, fantastic. Where can people go to buy your book?
Yeah, so She Deserves Better is anywhere books are sold, Amazon, wherever you go buy books. And you can find more information about us and the podcast and the Great Sex Rescue at my website, which is baremarriage.com, BARE, baremarriage.com. And you'll find Great Sex Rescue, She Deserves Better, the Bare Marriage podcast, our puberty course, everything is there. So go take a look at that.
Awesome. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks. Great to be here again.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.